Single mom got fired for being late after helping an injured man. He was the billionaire boss. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I need you to do something for me. See that subscribe button down below. If you believe in karma, if you believe that good things happen to good people, hit that button right now. Because this story, this incredible, jaw-dropping story, is going to restore your faith in humanity. And that like button? Smash it if you've ever been judged unfairly. If you've ever had your kindness thrown back in your face, only to watch the universe flip the script in the most unexpected way possible. Trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to want to come back and thank me. Now, let's get into it. Asterisk asterisk. The morning sun had barely crept above the horizon when Margaret Sullivan's alarm clock began its shrill cry at 5:15 a.m. Her hand shot out from beneath the thin blanket, silencing it with practiced precision. For a moment, she lay still in the darkness of her modest bedroom, listening to the quiet breathing of her daughter in the room next door, gathering the strength to face another day. At 34 years old, Margaret had learned that life rarely went according to plan. The wedding photos tucked away in the bottom drawer of her dresser told the story of a different woman, younger, more hopeful, naive enough to believe that love conquered all. Those photos featured a man who had promised her forever, a man who had walked out 3 years ago when their daughter Emma was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and a note that said he wasn't cut out for this kind of life. Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed and planted her feet firmly on the cold hardwood floor. She couldn't afford carpet, couldn't afford much of anything really, but she could afford to keep moving forward. That was all that mattered. The apartment was small, a 2-bedroom unit in a building that had seen better decades. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, the plumbing made concerning sounds at night, and the heating was unreliable at best. But it was theirs, and it was located in a decent school district, and Margaret had learned to measure her blessings in smaller increments than she once had. She moved through her morning routine with military efficiency. Shower in 5 minutes. Dress in 10. Start Emma's breakfast while packing her insulin kit and emergency supplies. Check blood sugar levels. Prepare the backup snacks. Review the medical information card that Emma's teacher kept in her desk drawer. Mom. A sleepy voice called from the doorway of the kitchen. Margaret turned to see her 7-year-old daughter rubbing her eyes, brown hair tangled from sleep, wearing her favorite pink pajamas with the unicorns that were now slightly too small, but that Emma refused to give up. Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay? Emma nodded, climbing into her usual chair at the kitchen table. I had a dream about Dad. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she kept her face neutral, her voice steady. Yeah? What happened in the dream? He came back, Emma said simply. He said he was sorry, and he brought me a puppy. Margaret set a bowl of carefully measured oatmeal with berries in front of her daughter, forcing a smile. That sounds like a nice dream. Do you think he'll ever really come back? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the hope and hurt that a 7-year-old could carry. Margaret sat down across from her daughter and took her small hands in her own. I don't know, baby, but I do know that you and me, we're a team. And we're doing just fine, aren't we? Emma nodded, though her eyes still carried that faraway look that made Margaret's heart ache. Yeah, Mom, we're a team. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from 2 people who have learned to read each other without words. When Emma finished, Margaret checked her blood sugar, 112, a good number, a number that meant the morning was starting right, and helped her get dressed for school. The walk to the bus stop was 4 blocks, and they made it every day regardless of weather. Rain, snow, heat, it didn't matter. This was their time together, these precious 20 minutes before the world demanded their separation. Remember, Margaret said as they reached the corner where the yellow bus would soon appear. Mrs. Henderson has your emergency kit. If you feel funny at all. I go to the nurse, Emma finished. I know, Mom. You tell me every day. Because I love you every day. Emma rolled her eyes in that way that children do, but she was smiling. I love you too, Mom. The bus arrived, and Margaret watched her daughter climb aboard, waving until the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Only then did she allow herself to check her watch and feel the familiar flutter of anxiety. 7:15 a.m. She needed to be at work by 8 a.m. sharp. Her office was a 40-minute bus ride across town, which meant she had exactly 5 minutes to walk to her own bus stop. If everything went perfectly, if the bus was on time, if there were no traffic delays, if nothing unexpected happened, she would arrive with a few minutes to spare. But in Margaret's experience, things rarely went perfectly. She walked briskly toward 3rd Avenue, her sensible work shoes clicking against the pavement. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up around her. Mr. Ortiz was opening the metal gate of his bodega. Mrs. Chun was walking her ancient poodle in the small patch of grass they generously called a park. A group of teenagers were already gathering on the corner, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings. This was Margaret's world, working class, struggling, but alive. These were her people. They watched out for each other, borrowed sugar when someone ran out, pretended not to notice when someone couldn't pay their electric bill on time. There was a dignity in this community that she had never found in the wealthier suburbs where she had grown up, where neighbors competed over lawn care and vacation photos. Her bus arrived at 7:23, and she climbed aboard, tapping her transit card against the reader. The fare, $2.75 each way, $5.50 per day, $27.50 per week, was another number she had memorized, another line item in the careful budget that governed her life. She found a seat near the back and pulled out the worn paperback she was reading, a romance novel she had picked up for 50 cents at a library sale. It was pure escapism, a story about a woman who found unexpected love with a handsome stranger, and Margaret knew it was silly, knew that real life never worked out that way, but she allowed herself this small pleasure. Everyone needed something to believe in, even if that something was fiction. The bus made its way through the city streets, stopping every few blocks to exchange passengers. Margaret kept one eye on her watch and one eye on the pages, splitting her attention between fantasy and reality. 7:45. They were making good time. She might actually arrive early for once, might actually have a chance to pour herself a cup of coffee before sitting down at her desk. The thought was almost decadent. But then the bus slowed, then stopped, and didn't move again. Margaret looked up from her book to see a sea of brake lights stretching ahead of them. A murmur ran through the passengers. Construction, accident, no one seemed to know. The driver opened the doors, letting in the cool morning air, and shrugged his shoulders at the collective frustration. Gonna be a while, folks. Sorry about that. Margaret checked her watch again. 7:48. If they started moving in the next few minutes, she might still make it. She closed her book and sat forward in her seat, as if her tension could somehow will the traffic to clear. She had been late twice already this month. Once when Emma had a blood sugar emergency that required a morning doctor's visit. Once when her usual bus had broken down and she'd had to wait for the next one. Her supervisor, a thin-lipped woman named Patricia Hendricks, had made it very clear that a third strike would have consequences. "I understand you have personal circumstances," Patricia had said, in that tone that suggested she understood nothing of the sort. "But this company values reliability. We all have challenges, Margaret. We don't all let them affect our work performance." The memory of that conversation made Margaret's stomach tighten. She needed this job. Not wanted, needed. It was the difference between paying rent and not, between buying Emma's insulin and not, between maintaining the fragile stability she had built and watching it all collapse. 7:52. The traffic began to inch forward, but they were still at least 15 blocks from her stop. She calculated the math in her head, knowing already that the numbers wouldn't add up. Even if they moved steadily, even if there were no more delays, she was going to be late. She thought about calling the office, but what would that accomplish? Patricia would give her that look, the one that said she was just another unreliable single mother making excuses. The other administrative assistants would whisper in the break room. And at the end of the day, she would still be late, still have that black mark on her record. 7:56. The bus stopped again, and this time, Margaret made a decision. She grabbed her bag, stood up, and made her way to the front. "I need to get off here," she said to the driver. He looked at her with tired eyes. "We're between stops, ma'am. Please. I'll be quick." Something in her voice must have conveyed the desperation she felt, because he nodded and opened the doors. "Good luck," he said, and she wondered if he saw versions of her every day, people running late for jobs they couldn't afford to lose. She stepped off the bus and began to walk quickly, then jog, then run. She was not dressed for running. Her work clothes, her sensible shoes, the bag bouncing against her hip, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the clock, ticking away the seconds she couldn't afford to lose. 10 blocks to go. She ran past storefronts and restaurants, past people who stared at the obviously crazy woman sprinting down the sidewalk, past her own reflection in shop windows. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, and she couldn't remember the last time she had pushed her body like this, but she kept going. 8 blocks. 6 blocks. She was going to make it. She might even have a minute to spare. And then she saw him. He was lying on the sidewalk near the entrance to an alleyway, a crumpled figure in an expensive suit that was now stained with dirt and something darker. There was blood on his face, flowing from a cut on his forehead, and his eyes were closed. Margaret's feet slowed without her permission. People were walking past him, businessmen in their hurry to get to work, women in their yoga pants heading to morning classes, delivery workers focused on their routes. No one stopped. No one even looked down. 3 blocks. She was only 3 blocks from work. She kept moving, kept running, but her eyes stayed on the man. He wasn't moving. He wasn't asking for help. He was just there, bleeding, ignored. 2 blocks. She could still make it. If she ran faster, if she pushed harder, she could still walk through those doors at exactly 8 a.m. and keep her job and pay her rent and buy her daughter's medicine. 1 block. Margaret stopped running. She stood on the sidewalk, breathing hard, sweat trickling down her back, and made the kind of decision that doesn't feel like a decision at all. It felt like inevitability. It felt like there was only one thing she could do, only one choice she could make, and still recognize herself in the mirror tomorrow. She turned around and ran back to the man on the ground. Up close, he looked worse than she had thought. The cut on his head was deep, still bleeding freely, and there was bruising around his eyes that suggested impact. His suit was expensive. She didn't know much about fashion, but she knew enough to recognize quality, and his watch glinted gold in the morning light. This was not a homeless man. This was not someone who had passed out from drink or drugs. This was someone who had been hurt. Sir? Sir, can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Margaret dropped her bag and knelt beside him, heedless of the dirt and blood that immediately stained her work pants. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, cradling it between her ear and shoulder while she assessed the damage. 911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance. There's a man injured on the sidewalk, corner of 5th and Madison. He's unconscious with a head wound. Significant bleeding. Is he breathing, ma'am? Margaret leaned down, putting her ear close to his mouth. She could feel warm air against her cheek, could see the slight rise and fall of his chest. Yes, he's breathing. Okay, I'm dispatching an ambulance now. Stay on the line with me. Can you tell me more about his injuries? Margaret described what she could see while carefully pressing her hand against the wound on his head, trying to slow the bleeding. Her first aid training from years ago was coming back in fragments. Apply pressure, keep them still, don't move someone with a potential head injury. You're doing great, the dispatcher said. Can you keep him stable? The ambulance is about 5 minutes out. Yes, I can do that. People were still walking past, though some had slowed to stare. A few had their phones out, filming, she realized with disgust, rather than helping. She wanted to scream at them, wanted to demand to know what was wrong with a world where people would rather record suffering than stop it, but she didn't have the energy to spare. The man on the ground groaned, and his eyes began to open. They were blue, she noticed, a striking, clear blue that seemed out of place against the blood and dirt on his face. Sir? Sir, can you hear me? Don't try to move. Help is coming. He blinked up at her, confusion clouding his expression. What happened? I don't know. I found you here on the ground. You have a cut on your head. Do you remember what happened? He tried to lift his hand to his face, but Margaret gently stopped him. Please don't touch it. There's an ambulance coming. Just stay still. I was walking. He squinted, as if trying to see through a fog. Someone came up behind me. I felt pain, and then someone attacked you? He didn't answer, his eyes sliding closed again. Margaret felt a spike of fear. Sir? Sir, stay with me. What's your name? Marcus, he murmured. Marcus. Sterling. The name meant nothing to her, but she used it, kept talking to him, kept him conscious until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics were efficient and professional, loading him onto a stretcher while asking her rapid-fire questions. Are you related to this man? No, I just found him. Do you know what happened? I think he was mugged. He mentioned someone coming up behind him. They got his information from his wallet, found on the ground nearby, emptied of cash but with his ID still intact, and began to prepare for transport. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair, turned to Margaret. "You probably saved his life," she said. That head wound. If it had kept bleeding, if he'd been lying here much longer. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. "Is he going to be okay? We'll do everything we can. He's going to Memorial General if you want to check on him later." And then they were gone, the ambulance disappearing into the flow of traffic, sirens wailing. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, covered in a stranger's blood, holding her bag in hands that were starting to shake. She checked her watch. 8:37 a.m. She was nearly 40 minutes late for work. The walk to her office building took Margaret through streets she had traveled hundreds of times before, but today everything felt different. She was acutely aware of the stares she was getting, the blood on her hands, her pants, even a streak on her blouse where she had unconsciously wiped her fingers. She looked like a crime scene. The lobby of Sullivan and Associates, no relation to her own Sullivan, just an unfortunate coincidence, was sleek and modern, all glass and chrome and carefully arranged furniture. The security guard at the front desk raised his eyebrows as she approached. "Rough morning, Margaret?" She managed a weak smile. "You could say that, George." The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt endless. She stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. There were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, lines around her mouth that spoke of stress rather than laughter. And now, blood on her clothes, a visible reminder of the choice she had made. The doors opened, and she stepped into the familiar maze of cubicles that made up the administrative floor. Heads turned as she passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and she could feel the weight of judgment settling on her shoulders. "Margaret, oh my God, are you okay?" The voice belonged to Carol, the closest thing she had to a friend in this place. Carol was a few years older, twice divorced, and possessed of a sharp tongue and a sharper eye. She stood up from her desk now, concern written all over her face. "I'm fine," Margaret said. "It's not my blood." "What happened?" "There was a man. He was hurt, on the street. I stopped to help him." Carol's concern transformed into something else, something that looked almost like pity. "Honey, please tell me you clocked in first." "I couldn't. I was already late from traffic, and he was bleeding, and I couldn't leave him there." The look Carol gave her then was complicated, admiration mixed with resignation, understanding tinged with something that might have been frustration. "Patricia is looking for you," she said quietly. "She's been asking where you are every 5 minutes since 8. "I know. I need to go talk to her. Do you want to clean up first?" "The bathroom." "No." Margaret straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. "If she's going to fire me, she can do it while looking at the reason why I was late." She walked toward Patricia's office with the same determination that had carried her through the last 3 years, through the divorce and the diagnosis, and all the small humiliations that came with being a single mother in a world that wasn't designed for them. Whatever was waiting for her behind that door, she would face it. She didn't have any other choice. Patricia Hendricks was sitting behind her desk when Margaret knocked, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her lips pressed into their familiar thin line. She looked up at Margaret's knock and her eyes widened, taking in the blood and the dirt and the general dishevelment. "Close the door," she said, "and sit down." Margaret did both, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from her supervisor and folding her hands in her lap. "I can explain." "I'm sure you can." Patricia removed her glasses and set them carefully on her desk. "I'm sure you have a very good reason for being." She checked her watch, 43 minutes late. "I'm sure it's a fascinating story. But I have to be honest with you, Margaret. I'm not sure I want to hear it. There was a man. There's always something." Patricia's voice was tired, almost regretful. "There's always a traffic delay or a sick child or an emergency that couldn't wait. And I understand. I really,